What happens when law, business, and life collide? Each week on Lead Counsel, your host Tom Tona will take a deep dive into topics related to the law, the business of law, and life. There will be insightful discussions with industry insiders, experts, and thought leaders making significant contributions and meaningful differences in their fields of expertise. Tom is the founder and managing attorney at TonaLaw. He has been a practicing attorney since 1994 and the leader of TonaLaw since it opened in 2001. The goal of this podcast is to provide you with free information on law and the business of law, and to give you actionable tools related to each of these areas. Now, here's Tom.
All right. Hello. We are here with the Lead Counsel podcast. This is your host, Tom Tona. I am here with my co-host, Jules. Jules, what's going on?
Hello. Welcome back.
Good to have you, Jules. You excited today?
I am.
We're going to be talking about one of my favorite things, and that's the importance of investigation early and often when it comes to cases in our office. And to that end, we have Keith Rohman. Keith, what's the name of your company?
Public Interest Investigations.
Public Interest Investigations, and it's out of California, right?
Los Angeles, absolutely.
Los Angeles, California. Do you do investigations nationwide, or you confined really to California and local market?
You know, we've done work all over the country, one way or the other. But I should tell you, Tom, I love your accent. I grew up on the edge of Mineola, in between Mineola and Roslyn.
Oh, there you go.
Every time I hear you talk, I go, that sounds like home.
And you were smart enough to get out of Long Island, which is awesome.
I got out of Dodge.
Although the politics are almost identical in California to New York.
Not when I was growing up, though.
No, it's changed a lot. But
at least you missed all the snow we got yesterday.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Do you live in LA?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I've been here for 41 years. So.
Oh, beautiful.
Keith, give us a little bit of background in terms of how you got to where you are today in terms of investigatory work that you do, and then the specific focuses and concentrations that you have.
So let me just start by, you're actually talking to me at a really opportune time because, it's literally like last week, I will have been a licensed investigator. This firm will have been operating for 40 years. So I've been at it for a minute. And I came from Long Island, came from New York. I went to college. I dropped out of college. I did a lot of political work. I did labor union organizing and community organizing all over the country. And then I sort of ended up, it's a longer story, not that interesting, but I ended up learning a little bit about investigation in that process and came to California, went to work for an agency. I started out by doing auto car crashes for an insurance company investigation. And then I got my license. And that was 40 years ago. And over the years, the firm has evolved as the way the field has evolved. And I know from having listened to a little of your work that you're interested in this whole area of how the law has changed and how it changes for people working in the law. And I started out doing a lot of work. I have a lot of love for plaintiff lawyers. I started out doing slip and falls, a lot of employment discrimination, sexual harassment, and the like. And we were litigation investigators. We worked for lawyers preparing for trials. And we did worked for a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers, worked for a lot of criminal defense lawyers. But over the years, the field has changed and it's evolved. There was a point kind of in the 90s when, you had the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, and all of a sudden sexual harassment starts to find its way not just into the public consciousness, but into the law. And employers start to have different needs for how to deal with those problems. And that just has continued with the Me Too movement, George Floyd's murder, the interest in Title IX on campuses. And so now our firm has evolved. Now my firm, while we're licensed as investigators, public interest investigations, about half our staff are lawyers who work as investigators. And my business partner is a lawyer. And most of my competitors in this field, the lawyers stayed in their lanes and the investigators stayed in their lanes. But now all the lawyers, they want to be investigators. And I know you've interviewed my very good friend and colleague, Sue Ann Vandermeiden.
I was going to say, I knew that. I think that's how I met you, is you reached out after having Sue Ann on.
There's another level of connect between us. But yeah, Sue Ann and I are very close. And, in another era, Sue Ann would have been a lawyer and I would have been an investigator, and we would never have done the same work. We would have been related. But the reality is, nowadays, what we're called upon, organizations have more of a different needs than they used to. And we end up working as third-party neutral investigators, but for lawyers, but also for corporations, public agencies, police departments, when they've got some internal controversy. Maybe the boss is accused of sexual harassment. Maybe a board member is accused of a conflict of interest. All of those things, they want a neutral third-party investigator to come in from the outside with skills, with ability, and do the fact-finding for them. And that third-party perspective, that's how we ended up with this sort of combination. My lawyers who work here are not involved in the practice of law. They are here as investigators.
Which is that's what allows you to basically employ them, because they're not practicing law under you couldn't own a law firm in California right now anyway, until the law changes. That would allow you to hire lawyers unless it's a pure investigatory firm, right? Where you're just doing investigations, right? So, and you answered a lot of the questions I was going to have, because I read the notes and I'm like, wait, you're working with the DOJ, police, sheriff's department, but you just explained it in the way I'm understanding it. It makes total sense now that you're basically like they have the internal affairs division. You're an external affairs division when internal affairs is part of the issue or something like that.
Right. Well, sure. And, not every organization has an internal affairs, and internal affairs can be a mixed bag, of course. But, what happens is there's something bad's happened, or something allegedly bad's happened. Let's just put it that way. Maybe the boss has sexually harassed someone. Maybe a board member has engaged in misconduct of some kind or another. And you've got a couple of constituencies you have to think about. You have to think about both your internal people and, is this going to be a whitewash like it was last time? Or are they going to do a really fair investigation? And then the flip side, what's the external community? What is, what are the regulators going to think about this? What are, if it's a media thing, and we get drawn into cases where there has been a lot of media attention. So the company says, okay, this is a problem. We've hired an independent investigator.
Right.
Well, that independent investigator, that sometimes is public interest investigations.
One of the things we're doing podcast wise is we have a bunch of really just the way things have traditionally shaken out. I tend to gravitate towards high level people doing high level things. That was the idea behind the podcast. But I've been really blessed even through today that all these powerful, really powerful women are now coming on and kind of giving a voice and a role model to the female contingency of listeners that are out there. And they're just doing really powerful things. And we have a bunch of really special guests coming in lined up.
Well, let me jump in real quickly and say that I get that point. My firm, and it's just the way it's happened, is probably 80% female. My business partner is a woman, and women make good investigators. And men can be great investigators, but women have some things that are sometimes a real plus in this work. And
I was going to say, and it's funny that you said that, because I was just listening to another podcast. Jules, it was the one you sent me about the guy that scans brains and how female leadership, something about the biology of the brain. And I'm not I do a lot of TBI cases, but it has to do with the decision-making portion of the brain and impulse control and ego, where female leadership, I find, and I have a large, I think we're probably about the same, 80% female in my office. My entire leadership team is female except for me. I find them to be very high-level thinkers and processors. And a lot of the stuff that I think is a fault for men, and I won't generalize sexist, but something about the biology of the brain that makes women particularly well suited for leadership. And I've been capitalizing on that. It's just it's been a tremendous boon to, I think, to business in general and the way that's morphed. And a lot of that has to do with the stuff you're talking about, the cultural shift that's gone on. So I have a question for you. Yeah. Did you start out with a background in law enforcement, or you started out as an investigator trained by the government and agencies, and you kind of just expanded from there?
I got a lot of on-the-job training, working at small agencies, doing one thing and another. Yes, 100 years ago. I mean, we are not, just to be clear, your trench coat investigators today. But way at the beginning, sure, I followed people around, and I took a lot of statements from people on car accidents, and I've attended a ton of training. I don't have a background in law enforcement, but over the years, you stick around long enough, we've done a lot of work with law enforcement. So, for instance, I served on a civilian oversight board at the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, overseeing internal affairs investigators, and played a role in training the IA investigators at LASD. Now,
Yeah, interesting.
Next week I'm going to Sacramento to train. It's called POST. This POST is the regulatory agency that investigates cops on a statewide basis, gives you essentially your license to be a cop. Okay. So I'm going to be training the entire staff, all their investigators, all of whom are former law enforcement, in how to do neutral, fair investigations. And then I did a lot of criminal defense. I was, in my early days of my career, probably the first 10 years, I was a criminal defense investigator on, murders, rapes, assaults and batteries, drug deals, all kinds of stuff, which gave me and gives our firm sort of a little different flavor when we start to roll into these investigations. So not a cop, but been around an awful lot.
But you've been around the block. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So sorry, Jules, go ahead.
Thank you. What got you started into private investigating? How did you decide that was like the career path for you?
Oh my God. Jules, it's kind of more of a stumble in than anything a major plan. But honestly, I thought I was going to have a career in politics. That's what really interested me. I wanted to change the world. I still kind of want to change the world, but I wanted to make it better. And I was, like I said, I worked for labor unions and community organizations. Mm-hmm. But I realized at some point that, I was pretty good with people and I had an interest in curiosity about things. And it seemed like, honestly, when I started, well, this would be kind of a cool thing to try out. Mm-hmm. I honestly didn't think that for the first 5-10 years of my career that I was going to stay with this. I always thought I'd go back to politics. But I had this concept for a firm that would use investigative skills to really look for the truth about what happens in situations. You can use your investigators for good, you can use your investigators for neutral, and you can use them for evil. And we try to mostly have a focus where we're using our skills to get to the bottom of whatever problem our organizations have, whether it's a sexual harassment complaint, whether it's a embezzlement complaint. We have a case involving a safety inspectors at an oil facility. Whatever those things are, we want to get to the bottom of it. And that just fascinates me. It still does. I mean, I'm past 60. Let's just be clear. But I just don't see myself retiring.
Well, look, that's because you clearly have a passion for it, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I find among all the high performers that come on the show. And I'm very blessed too. Like, I have really established people. They make great contacts through the show and people reach out to them for business. And, and look, we have a lot of criminal defense attorneys listening to the show, a lot of personal injury attorneys that listen to the show, both plaintiff and defendant. So I will make the following statement, and anybody that has tried cases will tell you, one of the single most important things we do at the beginning of every case involves, especially on the larger, more complex litigations, is bringing on an investigator. Right. And I don't have one case running where I don't have an investigator on the case to fill in the blanks, get me the video that might be out there that I could never get. So I think that it's critical, and they don't teach you this stuff in law school, by the way. So I have a lot of younger attorneys that listen to this. If you're in personal injury, you got to have a key investigator like Keith's company out of the gate, right? And it's the same thing with experts. Once I have the investigator, then I say, okay, what experts do I need? They don't teach you this in law school, right? You learn as you go.
Well, I mean, look, good facts make good lawyers.
And good cases and good cases. Yeah.
And settlements and verdicts and all things. Right. So you look better with the good facts, and knowing the bad facts ahead of time means you can stop throwing money down that drain.
Yes.
Now, the reality is, we are less litigation investigators than we were back in the day, but we still do some of that. And I'm happy to talk to those folks because we're more now this third party neutral stuff.
Right.
I will tell you, they don't always teach this stuff in law school, but I teach this stuff in law school. I'm actually an adjunct. For the last 20 years, I've been an adjunct professor at Loyola Law here in Los Angeles, where I teach a class in fact investigation with my colleague, Professor Susan Woolley. And actually, I had my class on Monday. And I can't tell you how many lawyers over the years have said to me, boy, I wish I had that class in law school.
Keith, as you're saying it, I'm like, look, I'm going on like 30. I graduated in 94.
There you go.
So it's been a minute, as you said earlier. And man, like, they could have given us real rules for litigation, right? Because I think 50% of lawyers go into practice for themselves, right? 50% of lawyers in America. Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah. I was reading a stat online the other day, and yet you're starting to run a personal injury inventory. And let's say you're working at a firm, and only 1% of lawyers have ever tried cases. So that's the other issue.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So you got these law firms, they're not trying the cases. And I've been blessed. I got to try cases very early in my career. So I realized realized, oh, wait, I need investigators. I need experts. This is what a jury needs to hear. And if they don't hear the right thing, it's not going to be the right outcome for the client. But the PI firms that are just settlement mills and not trying cases, the issue is they don't want to spend the money. They don't want to spend the money on the investigator, the expert. So you got to kind of say, well, is that the best thing for the client? Right? I don't personally think it is.
So that's how you're like making your mark on the world. So you kind of are changing the world by influencing future lawyers.
You know, nobody ever calls me up and says, hey, Keith, things are going great at my company or my public agency or on my board of directors. Can you investigate that? No, everybody's calling me with heartache, with a little surus, Tom, with just some problem. And sometimes it's small. Sometimes it's like, you know, I've just got these employees in this unit of these nurses at this hospital and they're just not getting along. And can we look into kind of figuring out what's the issue for them? But sometimes, you know, some of the work I've done has been in the news. And so I can talk about it's the chancellor of UC Berkeley who's accused of doing this, that, and the other thing. And the UC system needs an independent investigator to make a finding about what happened. You saw it happen in New York. You had the Cuomo investigation with the governor. I still follow New York politics. I love that stuff. Right. You just had an election yesterday.
Special election, right?
Yeah. So, you know, you need somebody who doesn't have a dog in this fight, who is trained in how to interact with people, how to gather evidence, how to organize that evidence, and then make a calm, rational finding. And then the organization says, let's let the chips fall where they may. And that becomes, I think, a huge part of the process with people is having somebody, because it helps you. It helps you with your internal, because you've got to have credibility with your internal people that you actually looked into it so that they feel safe. And whatever we find, because it may be true, it may be not true. And then the flip side is you've got external observers who are looking at this and going, who are these guys and how did what did they do? And the independent investigator, like public interest investigations and some of my great colleagues in this field in other firms are able to put together a report that documents everything we found, gets the pros, gets the cons, and then analyzes it and makes findings about it. And then the organization relies on it theoretically to move forward. Right. Now, sometimes they ignore my findings, but mostly no. Mostly they go, okay, fine. This is what we got to deal with now.
Well, and again, whatever the outcome is, it makes for a better organization as long as they don't disregard it entirely, right? Right. Yeah. But theoretically, all of the things that you're doing just lead to a higher level organization in general. And it should, right? That should be the outcome, regardless of the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So without compromising any kind of confidentiality, are you able to discuss one of the more challenging cases that you've worked on in the recent past or something in the public eye and the impact that it had?
You know, I mentioned the case involving the chancellor of UC Berkeley. That was in the news. I did an investigation of a member of the UC Board of Regents, obviously a lot of California stuff. Mm-hmm. We've done some other high profile cases that are more litigation related. We worked on investigations relating to the Abu Ghraib prison complex in Iraq. Where
Really?
For U.S. attorneys who were suing the defense contractors who helped run the prison. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East on that case.
You did.
So interesting.
And then for years, we did a lot of work. We don't do it so much now, but on death penalty cases where people are accused of, we work for defendants in capital crime, capital cases. But the work today, you know, is, of course, I can't really talk about any of our live cases, but it's not untypical for us to, maybe it's a big research lab. We've done a lot of research lab investigations and hospital investigations. A lot of times it relates to discrimination, but not always. I mean, we get cases nowadays, you get a lot of complaints of bullying in the workplace. People, you know, there's a changing atmosphere, people's changing expectations. Yeah. And then people call us, and maybe it's a board related thing where a board member has, in fact, done something that maybe they shouldn't have done. Like, you know, tried to get a contract that they shouldn't have gotten, or influenced an employee of the organization in a way they shouldn't have influenced them. The list goes on. And they want someone who's going to sort of step in. You know, every organization thinks they're special. Everyone thinks they're unique, and they're not wrong. They all have their own unique qualities, unique problems, unique cultures.
Right.
And they need an investigator who's going to be sensitive to those things. And they want you not to come in like a bull in a china shop. I talk to my law students about this need to have a balance in our presentation. I say, I'm going to teach you not to be lawyers, not to act like lawyers. I'm going to teach you to act like a human being. And if you're a lawyer who acts like a human being, that's a friggin' superpower, because it throws people off. They're not expecting that. They're scared. There's a lawyer in the room. We're going to go get tense about it. But you bring a human quality. So I teach my law students, I say, I want you to have on one side of the scale, warmth, connection, personality, transparency. On the other side of the scale, I want you to have observation, professionalism, preparation. And somewhere in the middle, when it works right, is the sweet spot that makes you an effective interviewer and makes you an effective investigator. And the other thing, I'll just add this and pile on with this a little bit, because at the end of the day, it's a lot about people. I mean, there are investigators out there whose firms are really devoted to data crunching, and they're doing open source research and the data crunching, and they can give you all this information. And we can do that for you, but we think a lot more about people. And, I've interviewed everybody. In 40 years, I've interviewed mayors, I've interviewed murderers, I've interviewed the homeless guy on the corner and the billionaire. And the thing that I've learned about doing a good interview is that interviewing somebody, and you're getting a little of that, more than a little. I listened to several of your podcasts. You're in relationship with somebody. For the period of time that you're doing the interview, you're in a relationship with them. Now, it's not like a love relationship, but it is a back and forth. And in a relationship, I've got to give you something. You've got to give me something. And, it's maybe the witness needs respect. Maybe they need to be heard. Maybe they just need you to help them calm down. And of course, I need something from them. And I need information. I need cooperation. So that period and that sense of what it means to be that back and forth is something that kind of permeates my firm. My lawyers at my firm think like investigators. My investigators at my firm think like lawyers. And that's a kind of a powerful process for us.
When you give advice to law students that you're teaching, and whether they're going to go into litigation or not, how do you address the need to remain neutral versus taking a position versus when you should take the position and when you advance that position?
Great question. And in fact, I do an entire class, 2 hours devoted to investigator biases. And so I'm starting from, look, there's a line from a writer, David Pell. He says, I think, therefore I am biased. We are all biased. And it's exactly what you say, Tom. I sometimes tell the story in this way. This goes back to our early caveman guys who they're looking way down a trail and they see somebody walking towards them and they have to make an instant judgment about whether that person is a friend or a member of your tribe or not. Or that rustle in the bushes, is that a bird going by or is that a dangerous animal? So we are wired, it's exactly right, to make some instant decisions. I mean, I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell's book, and his book, Blink. Blink really covers this stuff.
Yeah.
It's not uncontroversial. People have beefs about Blink, but nonetheless, he's on to something here. And and I do talk about, obviously, race bias, gender bias, sexual orientation bias, all those. But I'm actually really interested in what our investigator bias is. What are the things that we bring to the table? And, one of those is anything that favors my case, I'm more interested. There's confirmation bias. There is the preparation bias where people tell you something, and there's tons of science done about this. The social scientists have done all kinds of research. And one of the things that we learn is that if we bring our biases to the table, we will affect the type of information that we get. You can shape people's answers by the way you frame your questions. And, there's a Dr. Elizabeth Loftus from UC Irvine has done all this kind of groundbreaking research about this. But I don't teach you, don't be biased. What I teach you is let's surface your bias.
Awareness.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And let's think about it beforehand, because nobody is going to walk in and not be biased. Everybody is going to have, and we're going to be affected by the things. Maybe the guy across the table reminds me of the jerk I didn't like in high school. I can't tell you how many times a client calls me and says, a lawyer who's for a corporation, he says, Keith, I need you to do this neutral investigation. We have this complainant. She says X, Y, and Z happened. And then the following words come out of his mouth. He says, I don't want to bias you, but. And then he proceeds to tell me what his point of view is.
Right.
And that happens all the time. And I write it down and I just try to put it in a box and be aware that that's what he's bringing to the table. He's giving me some information. but it can't affect what it is, how I interact with people. And, you see it in confirmation bias, which is widely studied. Confirmation bias is seeking out the information that will tend to support the point of view you already have and ignoring information that is at odds with your point of view. And I'm just going to guess that everybody on this phone call and everybody listening to this podcast engages in that in at least one way in their life. And that's in the news. So I'm a little liberal. So mostly I don't get a lot of news I don't listen to Fox News that often.
Right.
Right. But I listen to CNN and maybe MSNBC. And so I'm seeking information that confirms my point of view and not listening. And we have a whole society based on. Well, that happens in investigation all the time. You're constantly getting that you're hearing information which favors you and you're paying more attention to it. And, the good trial lawyers, of course, you want the good news and the bad news.
Right.
You don't want any surprises at trial.
Right. The last thing, that's the last thing you want is, and I say this all the time, but there's a value to every case. I always in my head will frame it at whatever the level is. But I'm going to factor in everything, right? Because my North Star is what's the best thing for the client, right?
Yeah.
And as I say to clients all the time, it does you no good if we sit here and we bullshit ourselves, right?
Well put.
I'm a big, what are you laughing at, Jules? Because I cursed?
No, because that's probably exactly how he says it too.
Well, because you know what? Because clients, it's so stressful, right? And you touched on that earlier, Keith, right? Like people don't call me when they're like, life is awesome, I want to sue somebody. They're like, I was in a really horrific accident. I broke multiple bones in my body. I've had 4 surgeries. I can't work anymore. Like just bad stuff. So, sticking with the topic of bias for a second, because I've been fascinated with this. Even as I grew my business and I started out, it was me and a laptop. I hired my first paralegal, my second paralegal, and then we grew it to like 40 people, 25 internal,
congratulations.
15. Thank you. I don't know if you should congratulate me half the time, but 15 people overseas and 25 people here. And it wasn't until 2 years ago where I started to observe the dynamics within the corporation. And I was like, oh, there's some either conscious or subconscious bias going on here, right? Sitting around a table, 12 people in a room, one person only talks to the men in the room. I'm paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries and 80% of the organization is female. I want their opinion. I listen to every opinion at that table. And so I was like, oh, we need to fix this. Now, in that instance, it was just that person, we kind of parted ways, but it was eye-opening to me when I should.
No, you see it.
Yeah, you see it. And now I'm hyper-tuned to that. Then I also say to myself, like, as I talk, who I talk to, like, what are my own biases? I'm always checking in with myself of, am I remaining neutral when I'm analyzing situations? And what you do is incredibly high level brain processing and thought processing to remain neutral. I could not believe the amount of lifting that goes into just remaining neutral. So that's amazing to me.
I've thought about this too, and I worry myself about it. And
me too.
Yeah. And you're bringing clearly a first level skill to this, which is reading the room. A good investigator should be able to read the room. And I've walked into poor homes in Memphis and South LA, and I've walked into boardrooms in the highest office buildings and in the Capitol. You still have to read the room. Where are people at? What are their personalities? What is going on? What's the dynamic there? But I talk about bias and I say, look, there's no such thing as eliminating bias. You have to have, and I have a couple of mental steps I do. The first is monitor. I have a little acronym, MATE, M-A-T-E. It's kind of goofy, but it helps me keep it in mind. Monitor. Monitor, in other words, what's going on? What do I feel? What do I feel when I'm with you? What am I observing in the room? What am I observing about myself? This is how I address, because I can't eliminate bias, but I can lessen them. So monitor, acknowledge, and just say, okay, I've learned this. Let me get this out in the room. Let me make sure I understand that. And then the other piece of this, and it's part of how we train our investigators, and I think it's probably something that you probably do naturally. There's this whole field of what's referred to as trauma-informed interview techniques. And it's been developed for interviewing people who have been through trauma. And we are many times interviewing people who've been through trauma. It's your clients who are badly injured in an auto accident. It's a woman who is reporting she's been sexually assaulted. Maybe it's an employee who's being wrongly accused in the workplace, which is hugely traumatic and may have their whole career. And then there is, frankly, trauma is contagious. That's one of the things that trauma-informed teaches us, is that you can catch trauma. If you have a job where you talk to traumatized people all day long, you will find yourself picking up some of that. So being aware of that is a huge piece of the bias thing. It's not you don't think of it as like connected to bias, but it's connecting to you, part of it. And then finally, express. It's not enough just to think about this and ruminate about it. You need to get it outside of yourself. And I don't care who you talk to. You can talk to your rabbi, your priest, your colleagues. Mostly I have, great colleagues and I can talk with them, but somebody to sort of get this out of yourself. And if you can engage in that process, you won't be unbiased, but you will be better able to mitigate, better able to process, better able to bring that neutrality. Because I'll interview people who I think are just terrible human beings. Not everybody, of course.
Right.
But I want them to leave the room feeling as if he kind of liked me. Actually, in that moment, I do kind of like you. I'm focused on what your needs are. Even if you're accused of something bad, it's my job to get your whole story. Whatever it is, this isn't about me breaking you down and making, whap, 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 tell me the truth. No, I want you to tell me.
No rubber hoses? No rubber hoses?
No rubber hoses. No, I want you to tell me your truth. I'm not going to make or break this case based on what the person accused of the misconduct gives me. I'm going to make or break it more on what happened, what you told me, and then what everybody else tells me with the other evidence that we collect.
Right. So let me ask you a question, because as you're speaking, it's reminding me of one of my favorite books. You ever read the book Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss?
No, jotting it down.
Yeah, listen, it's a negotiation book. Probably one of my.
Yeah.
I will tell you that it has moved the needle for my clients multiple seven figures just by studying this book. But he's an ex-FBI negotiator.
Okay.
And I will tell you, a lot of what you're talking about is reflected in the negotiation tactics that he teaches. And they're not really tricks. They're not tactics. They're really methodologies. So I used the wrong word, but so a lot of it is approaching every negotiation with curiosity, right? Don't go in with an agenda, go in with curiosity. And curiosity allows you to free yourself of judgment and ask questions and gather information. Now that information will either lead to more of what you're looking for or less of it. But that less of it is because you're adjusting it down based on the information, right? But you have to kind of suspend judgment, right?
You have to, yes.
You have to ask great questions. And he has you using a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like that then gets into the hardwired biology of the brain, which is, labeling, mirroring, all of these different linguistic techniques that people tend to relate to you better when you're connecting with them in what's familiar. So Jules, what we're talking about is, mirroring, right? You repeat the last three words that somebody says, and they don't realize that subconsciously you're connecting with them. Because all of a sudden now you're plugging into that person's hardwired biology. So again, I'm fascinated by the stuff you do, Keith, because it involves people, which is one of my favorite topics, and it involves the human brain, which is there's so much we don't know about psychology and the brain. Even though we make great strides, it's the one thing you can't cut open a brain and understand how it works. No. Somewhat. I mean, they've made great strides, but I think that's why I find it so fascinating what you do.
But there's I'll just give this to you. What is that phrase? I'll give this one to you for free. This is a basic interview strategy that I use all the time. I teach my law students about. I teach when I do CLEs and present to investigators and to human relations professionals. We do a lot of work with HR professionals because they're often the line investigators inside an organization.
Yep.
Is repeating back information. So the witness says to me, and I just talked to my law school class about this on Monday. The witness says to me, well, here's what happened, A, B, and C. And I'm writing it all down, and they tell me it takes, a minute or so, and I write it down. And I say, that's really interesting. So what you're saying is that you saw A, B, and C happen. So I've just repeated back what they said to me. And it's just a really helpful tool because it allows you a couple of things at once. For one thing, it gives you time to catch up on your note taking.
Right.
Because they're going to start to repeat the same thing, some of what they said. Two, and this is the most important, it shows them you were listening.
Yep.
Because that turns out to be our superpower as investigators, our secret superpower. Because honestly, in many people's lives, nobody listens to them.
No one listens.
Their kids don't listen to them. Their friends are sitting at a bar drinking a beer and half listening to the music, half watching the game, and maybe not listening to them. Maybe their spouses don't listen. No one listens to them. You show up as the investigator and you take out your pen and your paper, and it's intimidating, but I will tell you, you have my undivided attention while I'm sitting there, and I am really listening. And that's a hugely powerful tool. And then the third thing, by repeating back information that you get from people, is that they add things. They go, oh, yeah, no, that's true, A, B, and C. But, I didn't actually tell you that what happened next is D and E.
Right.
And you've seen this. You've been a lawyer all these years, talking to all these people. You've seen this happen. It's a simple tool, but it's a powerful one.
Yeah, and I do the same thing and again, it's been a little bit because I have attorneys that work in the office, but doing depositions.
Yeah.
Done at the highest level, I ask very open-ended questions. And again, same thing where I say, oh, okay, so let me just paraphrase this, make sure I got it right. I'm not trying to trick anybody. Like even going into a deposition, I don't go in with an agenda. My whole goal is to try to uncover as much information as I can. So I'm not going to be surprised at trial. Now, very often, especially if somebody's lying to me, I can watch it in their eyes or the slight mannerisms. And then I've got the threads to start pulling. And that always fares well in litigation for us or for my clients. But yeah, I'm really glad that we did this. I could probably talk all day because we have that common thing about fascination with people, right? That's why you got into this 40 years ago. How many people are in your organization, by the way, from a business perspective?
15 folks, 3 or 4 admin, the rest are investigators. And, let me just tell you something. My firm has and this goes to your bias thing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a bias experience that I had. Yeah. That helped me. Our firm's corporate slogan is "The Truth Matters." We copyrighted that slogan years ago. And it's even on my mug.
I saw it. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something I had to evolve to because I started out as more of an advocate. I was an activist. I worked a lot on the plaintiffs and criminal defense side of the bar. And, I got hired. We do a lot of work in addition to our work for corporations and public entities. We do a lot of work for nonprofits when they have internal staff problems. And nonprofits have internal staff problems a lot. Now, I don't know more than others, but maybe a little more. And I got hired by, this is a case I can talk about in general terms because it was in the newspaper. I got hired by Amnesty International, and this is now some years ago. And an Amnesty volunteer had made some very, very powerful allegations. There was controversy inside the Amnesty board and leadership. And, I was am still a huge admirer of Amnesty International. They won the Nobel Peace Prize, for gosh sakes. And I'm a big supporter of theirs. And this was a kind of a public case for them. And I went and I interviewed this woman who was making these allegations. And I did this whole investigation. And at some point, I began to realize, I don't think she's actually telling the truth. And I realized that if I came to that conclusion, that was not going to be a good day for Amnesty. That this was going to be a public thing. It's going to make the organization not look good. And I had this moment, kind of where the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I was in a small hotel room in a rural part of the country with all the case laid out in front of me on a bed. Remember, the All-Star game was on the TV in the background. And I'm just kind of going, oh my God, I don't think she's telling the truth. And I knew if I wrote this report the way I had come to believe it was going to be a bad day for Amnesty. And I had a moment of choice that I had to make. And it was the point at which I realized, I'm not as much of an advocate as I used to be. Now I really care about the truth. I mean, it sounds grandiose, and I don't want to make myself out to be some sort of hero here, but the truth does matter. That's the thing. You say I'm passionate about the work. I am passionate about the work. But I'm passionate about wanting to know what happened. And I wrote my report, and it was a bad day for Amnesty. The board of directors, this is all covered in a big New Yorker article of all things. The board of directors split. The people who had hired me were fired or quit. There was news coverage. And, this is years ago. Amnesty recovered and has gone on to do great work ever since. Right. But for me, it was a moment where I realized I had changed. I'm not just an advocate. Now, guess what? I've grown up to be an investigator. So.
Awesome. Listen, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Wonderful.
I ask everybody this, and I'd be kind of curious because you've been into your career 40 years now. What would you say is the biggest needle mover in your life that's brought you to the point of accomplishment and fulfillment that you're at right now with your career?
Well, it's funny. I hear you asked that question before, and it's sometimes about in your business. So you have asked my life. You throw
Could be either. Could be either.
We don't have time for my life, but I will tell you that on the biggest one for my professional life has just been my involvement with nonprofit organizations that are engaged in my, this Association of Workplace Investigators. It's how I met Sue Ann. It's how I've gotten to meet hundreds of people. I've become a trainer. I go all over the country. Those connections have enabled me to really build. And that's the thing I tell people. People call me, I'm starting out as an investigator. What should I do? I said, get the heck out of the office.
Yep.
Go get it. And don't just show up, sign up for this organization or that organization. Get involved. Get on a committee. Do some service, because no one, sure, you can stand around at the annual conference and hand out your business cards. But honestly, you can do that till the cows come home, and It's not going to make work. But you get on a committee and you and 10 other people in your field are struggling with some difficult organizational issue, and they see you and they learn about you and they connect with you. I think that's been, for me, the biggest that has made my practice grow.
I love that. And I'll tell you why. There's a common thread. Jules, you hear it every time we have the highest performers on. It's kind of like a iteration of Dale Carnegie, right? Mm-hmm. Put the other person first.
Oh, yeah.
Don't seek to sell, provide value, and the rest takes care of itself, right? Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you're saying. That's why, I love when I start to hear these common threads through high performers. One of my buddies owns a multiple 8-figure law firm. He's crushing it, 4 different states. Yeah. He has a common saying. Get out from behind your desk. Nothing great's going to happen in your business from you sitting behind your desk, right? I travel monthly nationwide talking to people, growing my practice presence and brand nationwide. That's why I get on a plane. Building connections is one of the top things you need to do. Stop treating people transactionally. Don't worry about what's in it for you and trust the process.
But you will get much more back in return. Well, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Because I'm more comfortable asking questions than answering questions.
Go ahead. You're going to put the spotlight on me. I'm starting to sweat now.
I love plaintiff lawyers. I really do. I mean, that's where I started.
I appreciate that.
They're the scrappers of the law profession. And the good ones they're fun to hang out with. But one of the things, I've been very lucky because I have done well professionally by doing good. And I think that good plaintiff lawyers, that's what happens to them. And I wondered how you feel about how that's played out for you in your life, in your work, because I know you've done well, and my sense is you've done good. And how do you see that interplay for you and the importance of those things?
I think one of the things I talk about a lot is self-awareness, right? And,
okay, great.
And so I had a huge epiphany going through some coaching exercises. I went from an iteration of what was a goal for my law firm? Well, I want to be a X-figure law firm, 8-figure law firm, right? But then I realized the money is secondary, to be honest with you, because I want what's best for my clients. One of my core values, my top core value is superior lawyering. That morphed into, I'm not a personal injury attorney. I'm a personal injury trial attorney. And so for years, I got complacent because you can make a lot of money
settling cases
and not have to make yourself work all that hard. But that's not what's best for the client. And I came from the trial world. I tried cases. I tried a fair amount of cases. And what I realized is I got to give everything I have to these clients. And so do the lawyers in my organization. And so when we rolled out the core values and the cultural documents to everybody, and all we preach is the core values. So my biggest needle mover and doing well, doing good. You said, well, what is the role of doing good? I came to the epiphany of doing better. Right. I wanted to do better work for the clients. Like the other night, I was working till 8:30 on a case. The trial's coming up next week. I don't have to work till 8:30. My trial guy and I were on the phone with the client. Case got put to bed at 9 o'clock at night. I was up since 4 in the morning, and I've been working on this case for weeks, months.
Yeah.
And it got put to bed, the right result for the client. The client is still texting me, thank you. I slept good for the first time in 5 years. So yes, doing good matters, right? You want to go out into the world and do good. Bare minimum, do no harm on a regular basis.
No harm. And
right. But if you're in a position where you're privileged to have a license like I am, right? As lawyers, we're privileged. We have access to a system that very few Americans understand, have access to. You can't go in and represent yourself in court. We're privileged to do that for people, right? don't take that for granted. Don't get complacent. Don't get lazy. For me, the biggest needle mover was realizing how gifted and blessed I am to have that privilege to serve, like you said, serve others, and then do it every day with the same level of intensity. You're tired, you show up anyway, you do it. You leave everything on the mat for that client. So that's kind of been my philosophy.
That's a great answer. Yeah. Hey, well, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, of course.
For Juliet, what's it like working for such a madman?
Oh, it's a big bowl of fun. Honestly, we never have like a dull moment.
Tom, I'm so impressed with what you've done. I listened to your Dan Feynman. Dan Feynman is actually how we connect.
Oh, yes. I love Dan. He's a big part of my future planning.
Yeah. And I listened to a bunch of, I'm happy to be part of this process and happy to talk about the work and admire what you're doing. So
awesome.
Yeah,
listen,
fantastic.
thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, thank you so much.
What'll you tell us where people can find your company and how best to get in touch with you, and we'll put it in the show notes as well.
I'm pretty easy to Google. There aren't too many of just my last name will take you to my LinkedIn and blah blah blah. But my firm is called Public Interest Investigations, and our website, that's also easy to Google. But our website is www.PIILA.com. Pretty simple.
Awesome.
So thanks so much for having me on, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Awesome. I do. And if you ever have a case close out that you could talk about, super interesting, I'd love to have you back on again, man.
Okay.
I love talking about this stuff. So thank you for coming on, Keith. And that's Keith Rohman. And this is the Lead Counsel Podcast. Listen wherever podcasts are distributed, and go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review, and share it with any of your friends, attorneys or non-attorneys. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.